This is the story of a forgotten Volkswagen that sat neglected in my garage for far too long. I bought it back in 2014, gave it a fresh coat of paint, and after one drive, parked it in the corner where it stayed. Last year, however, I decided to change that. This is the journey of transforming this simple air-cooled Volkswagen into an absolute blast of a weekend cruiser, built for both on-road and off-roading. This whole project begins with a donor, right rear 3000 GT turbo, welded onto the Stinger exhaust of my buggy. This first step was the inspiration needed to get the project off the ground. It also required I buy a new TIG welder, so I decided to build a downpipe to play with that as well, because nobody buys a new toy and doesn't play with it. After that detour though, I had to get serious into tearing this project down to build it the way I wanted. So the carbs had to go, as fuel injection was in the little 1600s future. I needed new intakes, as well as new individual runners, as the one here was made for one carb to feed 2 cylinders. In the process of removing things, I decided those awful heater ducts had to go as well, so the whole shroud was coming off at this point. The generator had to come off as well, and since the shroud and generator was off, I thought I might as well pull all the tins and paint them up and degrease the engine. Do I smell scope creep? I'm sure it's fine. Now on with a tiny bit of movie magic. Those heater ducts, they're gonna be gone. Ready? And like that, I've trimmed them off. Now to check fitment with the new intake manifold runners before a patch panel is fitted up. The intake I used is designed to fit IDF 44 carbs, but I'll plumb intake runners from the plenum into them. With a bit of welding and bodywork, the shroud is ready for paint. I sanded the shroud and other tins with 180 grit sandpaper to get a good bite for the paint, and then sprayed it with a primer and followed up with a flat black to hide imperfections on the sheet metal, as I'm not a professional bodyman. While we're waiting for that paint to dry, I figured I'd talk about the little TD04-9B turbo and why it's an excellent choice for my 1600 Volkswagen. Before that though, I figure I'll explain a bit about turbos and how they work. On screen, we have a typical turbo. This one in particular is internally gated and twin scroll. We will touch on each of those in a moment. So the basic operation of turbochargers is as follows. You put hopes and dreams in this end. After that, you get large bills, preferably $20 US or larger, and you feed them in here. This next part relies on a bit of magic and luck by mixing your hopes and dreams with that money you fed it, and if all works out, you should get magical horsepower out of this end right here. Okay, but in all seriousness, the turbo does begin life at the turbine housing, which in this case is twin scroll, since it's divided housing. This provides better response given a matching manifold setup. Now, hot exhaust gases are fed into the turbine wheel, making the turbine and compressor unit spin together. Take note on the wheel and valve in the turbine housing here. Hot gases exit at this end after spinning up the wheel, and that valve regulates how much exhaust is allowed to act on the turbine. This valve is actuated by the diaphragm that is pushed on by the pressure created from the turbo. This is the wastegate system, and since it's all enclosed in the turbo unit, it is internally gated. There is a spring inside the diaphragm housing that determines the amount of pressure required to open it up. The barb fitting is used to plumb the wastegate either to the manifold or to the compressor housing depending on your desired setup. A fitting like the one here on the compressor housing can be used to control the wastegate directly. Moving on to the compressor housing though, the shaft spun by the exhaust is connected to the compressor wheel, and when this wheel speeds up to operating speeds, which can range anywhere from 20,000 RPMs all the way up to 200,000 RPMs and beyond, it begins creating pressure by throwing the air outward in the compressor housing. That pressure then exits the compressor housing and is directed through the charge system into the engine. Now this is a very basic overview, and I will gladly go into further depth if you, the audience, would like. I just don't want to drone on and make a nonsense video here. So leave me a comment and let me know. Moving on though, now that we have a basic understanding of turbos, I'd like to explain why I chose this turbo for my buggy. So compressor selection needs to be done with the compressor map, like the one on screen, and the individual islands represent efficiency, with the centermost island being the best place to operate. You figure your engine's place on these graphs by using volumetric efficiency and brake-specific fuel consumption, along with RPM and a pressure ratio required to achieve desired horsepower and air mass over time. Once plotted, you can see if you're too far left and surging, which is very bad, or too far right, which is oversped, and also can end in catastrophic failure, or it just might make heat, which is also bad. If you fall into one of the islands, though, that is where you want to be. Now, with that knowledge, we know that this is dependent on engine size, RPM, and volumetric efficiency. So by picking a turbo that came off a 3-liter, making 300 horsepower at 5,500 RPM, in a twin-turbo configuration, this turbo by itself is capable of supporting 1.5 liters and 150 horsepower at 5,500 RPMs. With that knowledge, I can assume the less efficient 1600 will likely work since I'm shooting for 90 to 100 horsepower at less than 5,000 RPM. I did actually do the math, and it works out, but it's a simple way to size a turbo based on the R&D spent by a very large company. And now we know why I have a Mitsubishi turbo on a Volkswagen. Now that the paint is dry, and we covered turbos, I'll start reassembling the shroud and tins in preparation for 3D scanning. So I used a 3D scan spray and the original CR scan to scan the engine bay. I think it's an engine bay, engine hatch, not sure. Either way, I scanned in preparation of creating the sheet metal intake out of 6061 aluminum. So on screen is the cleaned up mesh of the scan. I won't bore you with watching me clean up a scan as it's like watching paint dry, and we don't do that around here. Modeled alongside the mesh, we can see the sheet metal intake that I will be building. I'll have 1/8 inch, 0.125 inch, 6061 aluminum, laser cut, and I'll weld it together with a TIG welder, which you will see on the next episode of the series. I'll show you a sneak peek now though, since I kind of already have the footage. So thanks for watching, subscribe, and leave a like. Thanks.